later when
sure they're all Tim's. Welcome everyone to this week's session of the China-U.S. Women's Foundation Zoom sessions, Women's Power Toolkit. We're so excited to have Isaac Stonefish, CEO and founder of Strategy Risk, for a casual conversation about what we can look forward to under a Biden administration in terms of our relationship with China. From a personal perspective, and as executive director of the Women's Foundation, I'm hopeful because I feel like there is more willingness to listen from Biden's perspective, but I'm also realistic that there's real competition between China and the U.S. and many issues that will need to be addressed. But I'm hopeful that through goodwill and competent politicians and administrators that we will move to a better place. Questions that I'll be looking for is, is there goodwill after Trump? What are the prospects for moving forward together? What are the regulatory issues that are going to be sticky? So many things. But again, I feel that women to women conversations can really help this whole matter, and look forward to future discussions on our platform about these relations. But I'm going to now pass the mic over to Lisa, our Chief Digital Officer, who will engage in the conversation. Thank you, Lisa. Thank you,
Thank
Isaac.
you, Leslie. Yes, I want to just add that Isaac has an impressive resume. He's contributing columnist to the Washington Post, a visiting fellow at the German Marshall Fund, an on-air contributor to CBSN, and the author of a monthly column on China risk for Barron's. A fluent Mandarin speaker, Isaac lived in Beijing for 6 years. He is also a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations, where I had the pleasure of working, a Truman National Security Fellow, an alumni of the World Economic Forum's Global Shapers program, and the author of a forthcoming book on Beijing's influence in America from Knopf. So I'm looking forward to reading that. I'm just seeing here, just checking my speaker views, looking a little funny. Let me go back. But welcome, Isaac.
Thank you. It's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
We wanted to just start off by asking you, how did you become so interested in China?
I've been doing this for roughly 2 decades, and it started when I was in high school. I grew up in Syracuse, a small city in central New York that the Chinese call Snow City for how much darn precipitation we get. But when I was, about 16 or 17, I wanted to get as far away as possible from my little hometown. And I was looking at summer programs, and there was one in Bolivia and one in Senegal and one in Western China. And I think I picked China because it was a very simplistic reason at the time, but China was bigger. So I just thought, there'd be more to do here. I won't get bored. And so I spent a summer in Xinjiang, got the bug that a lot of the people in the fields have as well. Spent the next summer in Tibet, and then was off to the races there, studied Chinese in college, moved to Beijing after graduation.
I was always struck how great your Mandarin is. How was it learning to speak so well?
I remember studying Chinese for 2 years at college, and then getting to Beijing for a summer program, and being very proud of my Mandarin and getting into a taxi and having absolutely no ability to have myself understood. So I really feel like I didn't have any sort of facility with the language until I started spending time there. And it's one of the things I miss the most about living in Beijing is the opportunity to just use the language on a daily basis. So it was just a lot of time. I think people will say, it's such a tough language, but I think it's just spend a lot of time, and then, it comes together.
You must have seen quite a few changes in Beijing. I was there in 2007 and then again in 2019, and I was struck how much it had changed. Can you tell us a little bit about living in Beijing?
Definitely. So the changes that I've seen, especially over the last several years, have mostly been quite grim and depressing. I think when I was there, and I'm not going to do one of the, in the good old days of Beijing, but I was very struck and impressed by this sense of optimism in the years leading up to the Beijing Olympics, this kind of recurring, China can now stand proudly on the world stage. And I'm quite worried about how that's morphed under Chairman Xi into this, I want to say sense of entitlement, but this feeling that for many people in China, the goal is returning to a global system where China is the dominant player, where like 中国说的算, like whatever China says goes. And I think there's a lot of really potential friction points that we're already starting to see play out between the US and China, China and Japan, China and India. So it is both a fascinating and a worrying time to be in this space.
Now, you've launched a new company, it seems fairly recently, Strategy Risks. Can you give us a little overview of what you're planning with that?
Definitely. So I started the company last year. I went public with it a few months ago, and I got pretty frustrated with the ESG space. It's a sort of corporate social responsibility type metric for impact and ethical investing, because the company could say have good climate policies, which is very important, but also make surveillance cameras for concentration camps and still have a high ESG score. So I realized that in the ESG space, a lot of the rankings were fairly divorced from the reality of what Chinese companies were doing. Then I realized there just wasn't any sort of good way of measuring corporate exposure to China more broadly, and to Beijing and to the Communist Party. And one thing that CCP and I very much agree on is the centrality of the party and the centrality of politics in Chinese decision making. So at Strategy Risks, we do data work, we do due diligence, and we do analysis with a very heavy political focus.
Interesting. Now, since obviously the timing of your talk is particularly wonderful, as Biden just spoke last night, do you have any thoughts about the speech that he gave?
I did like the mixture between here's what we need to do to compete with Beijing, and as I think Leslie was saying before, this new type of hope and an uplifting narrative. I think it was very much in dialogue with this American carnage idea that Trump was spreading. And I definitely did make me feel more optimistic about the direction the US political system's going in.
What do you think will be the key issues that will define U.S. China relations under the Biden era?
I think and this is maybe part of the problem, but I think it's going to be different issues for the US side and different issues for the Chinese side. I think the overarching issue is whether or not the United States can live with a powerful China ruled by the Chinese Communist Party. And I remember speaking to a Chinese diplomat several years ago who compared it to two neighbors, and one's lawn, China's lawn, kept getting bigger and bigger, and the other neighbor had to deal with that. The economic fundamentals are, broadly speaking, much better in China than the United States. The US still has a far more powerful military and a much more effective system of alliances than China's, one could say, fair weather friends in Pakistan and Cambodia. But it does feel like this is going to be about the military. And the Chinese Communist Party defines military much more broadly than the US did. I think a former Chinese vice minister of propaganda talked about the Chinese propaganda department as similar to the US Defense Department, something necessary for stability, both globally and domestically. But I do think that maybe this year, maybe in several years, maybe longer, it will very much be a military question, whether it's over Taiwan or contested islands in the East Sea or in the South Sea. I think beyond that, trade is, of course, going to continue to be very important. And I think also Xinjiang, the region in Northwest China with their upwards of 1 million Muslims in concentration camps, is going to be a very important issue for the United States as well.
I was struck, a friend of mine creates merchandise for a big company in the United States, and she said it was a major issue now where your cotton comes from. And she was checking with all of her vendors and deciding if she was going to move to another country for the cotton, which was interesting to see it play out in the day-to-day of manufacturing.
Definitely. It's a very difficult issue. I think they're just getting to the point where you can test the cotton to see where it comes from, but it's very difficult to unwind and move around supply chains. It's very expensive, so it's quite a headache for a lot of manufacturers.
I was struck when Secretary of State Blinken was, got the job. A lot of people said it was good because he did understand Asia better than many people in the State Department. Were you pleased with his appointment?
I was pleased to hear how he's acted and spoken recently. I was worried that because of his quite deep corporate background via West Exec and the consulting that he's done, that he would be more of, in some small but meaningful ways, a voice for corporate interests. And I haven't seen him do that. And I've been impressed and pleased by his commitment, at least publicly, to speaking about human rights issues in China. I've also seen a much more organized and competent State Department, from the outside. The way that I'm viewing this then was certainly the case under Tillerson and also under Pompeo. So it does feel like diplomatic morale is higher. I think people are a little worried about how long it's taking to fill certain key ambassadorial posts. And I think there's also, the US tends to give these to political friends as opposed to career diplomats, but hopefully the Biden administration will appoint someone who has a lot of diplomatic experience in China, in Japan, and other key countries around the region.
Yeah, I think anyone who paid attention to the international politic and the State Department was a little horrified under the last administration how people left and the positions weren't filled. And my understanding was there was a lot of just empty positions and work wasn't getting done. I would assume Biden's administration has a lot of work just to get it back up to snuff.
Right. It seems like they're doing a much better job. Again, it was quite a low base compared to Trump's State Department, but people are optimistic about the direction it's going in.
Now, what do you think about trade? What have you heard will be happening in that sphere?
I think the Biden administration is trying to throw out the framework of phase 1 trade deal, phase 2 trade deal, trade war. They're not removing the tariffs. USTR, Catherine Tai, has said, well, yeah, we're going to keep these. They're good leverage for us. But I think they're trying to figure out what is the way they want to construct, less the nuts and bolts of it, but what is the framework of the U.S. China trade relationship. And the Biden administration has been fairly coy about what direction they're going in. I think where Biden wants to be so far, at least where he wants to present himself as being, is, okay, this is a very domestic issue. So I think he said in his speech, why can't we make wind turbines in Pittsburgh instead of Beijing? And so I think a lot of the trade dynamic, both for Republicans and Democrats, will be, how do we bring jobs back to America? I think economists tend to see the issues quite differently, but I think that's the way it will be framed from a political perspective.
Yeah, that makes sense. Jobs, of course, are key. And what do you think about, I must say, when I was last in Beijing, I had the remarkable experience of going to the China Daily and meeting with the woman who managed sort of marketing, and going into that newspaper, which is the a mouthpiece for the government. It was just large pictures of old men all over the place. Yeah. Do you feel like there will be any women rising up in China that we're just not seeing in more the political sphere?
That would be great. I think right now there's one woman on the Politburo, which is a 25-member body that rules China. It does better than a lot of its neighbors. Japan and South Korea and North Korea do a pretty horrible job at promoting women, especially in politics, but it is still fairly grim. There's still a lot of sexism baked in. Women have basically been all but absent from the top layers of the Chinese Communist Party. As far as I know, there are no rising stars who might enter into the Politburo Standing Committee, which is the 7 or 9 member body that really rules China. And the women who have been in the Standing Committee in the past have been political spouses. And then the most powerful women in China recently have been, to put it mildly, quite negative role models. People like Jiang Qing, who was Mao's wife and one of the architects of the Cultural Revolution. So it's different in business, it's different in the arts, but politically it's old men, old Chinese men.
Yeah, I was surprised actually to read about President Chu's wife, that she was a well-known singer.
She made the rounds, I think in the U.S. because she serenaded the troops on Tiananmen Square. I think I don't remember if it was either right before or right after the massacre, but there's sort of a famous, notorious photo of her doing that. But I think in a Chinese political context, that is in some ways a rebuke to Hu Jintao, whose wife was very, very low key and not seen at all glamorous. And Hu Jintao himself, Xi Jinping's predecessor, some Chinese would compare to a wooden puppet. He was just very, very stiff, very formal, very talking points. And Xi Jinping seems a lot more comfortable in his skin. And Peng Liyuan, his wife, is certainly a lot more charming and charismatic than Hu Jintao's wife.
Oh, interesting. Now, the Chinese economy seems to be booming. Can you give us a report on that?
It does. So I think it grew, I think roughly 18% year on year. It hit pretty hard last year by COVID, but there's a lot of really promising sectors across the Chinese economy. I think there's a lot that we're going to see in tech and green tech, and also in coal, steel. I think it's funny, Xi Jinping at Biden's Earth Day said, okay, well, we're going to strictly limit the growth of coal. So there's still a lot of money that's being made and to be made in the Chinese dirty energy sector. And I don't think we're going to see it. I think that'll still be a pretty large and appealing growth element to a lot of people in SOEs. It's funny, as part of my job, we're a risk firm. So there's a lot of positives in the Chinese economic story. We tend to focus on the negatives because that's the side of the business that we're on, so to speak. So we look a lot at what's been going on with the restrictions on tech firms and what is Beijing trying to do? What message are they sending to Alibaba, to Tencent, and to the delivery company Meituan, which is under a type of investigation as well.
Yes, I was going to ask about that. I was quite shocked to read how aggressively they're going after these moguls. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So there's a concept in China called the curse of Forbes. And it's a half joke, but it's also half serious. And it's the idea that anyone who gets to the top of the Forbes China rich list will fall. And they've basically been 100% accurate on that. And Jack Ma, who was there for quite a while, we don't know yet, Jack Ma, the Alibaba co-founder, we don't know yet if he's going to be in prison or if he's just going to be much reduced. But the way the thinking goes is that Beijing and Xi Jinping in particular doesn't want there to be independent power sources. And who's ever the most powerful man outside of the government and the party in China is in a very dangerous position. And Jack Ma held that title for a while. And now that Jack Ma has been reduced, kind of wonder who would be next. Pony Ma, who's the founder of Tencent, no relation to Jack, was very, very different personality-wise, much more low-key, much less in the media, and certainly seems like that strategy has served him well. Tencent is also being hit by some fines, but they seem to be in a much better place politically than Alibaba is right now. So for a lot of these things, it's difficult to know, is Beijing doing these because it feels like the tech sector is too monopolistic and that's stifling growth and harming consumers? Are they doing this because they have political bones to pick with Jack Ma, Pony Ma, and these other tech billionaires? Or is it some combination of the two? It's very difficult to say. The safe bet is that it's some combination of the two. And in some ways, it's akin to the anti-corruption campaign that Xi carried out more so earlier in his tenure, but which is still, in other words, alive today. And a lot of the Chinese officials had massive problems with corruption. And a lot of the big people who fell were almost certainly corrupt and extorting money or blackmailing or taking bribes. At the same time, it also felt like a lot of the prosecution and maybe everyone who fell, there was a political reason for that.
Mm. They did execute a man for corruption, which I seemed a bit extreme, but I guess.
Yes, yep, they're proud of their execution. There's a lot of forget what the numbers are, but there's the party is above the law and also carries out its own law. And yeah, there's been some pretty extreme punishments carried out to people who ran afoul of these rules and regulations, both gray and otherwise.
I guess they hope that it makes others think twice if it's such an extreme punishment. Well,
Yeah.
speaking of punishments, what do you think about what's going on in Hong Kong?
I was wondering what the segue there was going to be. I think to keep with the unfortunate negative direction and tone of all this, the most worrying thing about Hong Kong is what it broadcasts about Beijing's intentions towards Taiwan. One of the reasons why Hong Kong was given such a long leash for such a long time was Beijing believed that it could convince Taiwan to reunify into this one country, two systems type model that Hong Kong had. And for whatever reason, Beijing decided that it no longer needed to keep Hong Kong as a semi-open territory to placate and please Taiwan. And so they decided to send a different message, which is, this is what happens to opposition to Beijing. It's difficult to know how much of that was driven from the center, how much of that was frustration in other financial centers in China, like Shanghai and Shenzhen, that Hong Kong was taking too much of the oxygen. But certainly, I don't want to say that of all the parts of China, I'm most pessimistic about Hong Kong, but it seems like the ability for Hong Kong to function as this middle ground between China and the West and China and Taiwan is over. And Hong Kong is becoming, like people have said, a lot like just another Chinese city, and there's a lot less space for political and even economic freedom there.
Yeah, when I was visiting, I was in Hong Kong 2 years ago, staying with a Chinese friend from Shanghai. And she said when she chose to go to Hong Kong, her friends in Shanghai said, "Why would you want to go to a third tier city?"
Oof. Oof,
Now things have
that
changed.
hurts.
Yeah, we went out I took her out. Friends are in the movie industry in Hong Kong, and that had been such a booming industry for years. And the one man was telling me quite sadly that all the money is moved to mainland China. And so the movies just don't get made unless you go to mainland China to make them. And he was quite discouraged, which was eye-opening to me how much of it had changed. And now, what do you think about Taiwan? It seems a tough situation, as obviously it's going to be difficult for others to defend Taiwan just because of the size difference between China and Taiwan.
I think so much depends on whether or not, if Beijing does invade, and Beijing has been threatening to invade Taiwan since 1949, when the nationalists fled the mainland for Taiwan. And because it's far enough away from the PRC coasts, and the terrain is rugged enough and the Taiwanese military is effective enough that it would be difficult for Beijing to seize the island. We don't know how much cyber would play, how much information warfare would play. We think there'd be a lot of different non-traditional military assets employed if Beijing decided to seize Taiwan. But it really does feel like that is one of the most likely, if not the most likely, starters of World War III. And as much as I love Kantian ideas of perpetual peace, I don't think we're living in a post-war world. I do feel like at some point there will be a war between China and another country, and hopefully it'll stay a small proxy war. But it is certainly possible that because of Taiwan or because of Japan or because of India and their relationship with China and what the Communist Party does, there will be another major war.
On a brighter note, what about with climate change and work that China seems to be doing to improve their climate record?
Well, it certainly is brighter than the prospects of a nuclear holocaust. I think we talked a little bit before about Biden's climate summit and Xi's promise about reducing the increase of coal. I think I think it's difficult. I think often the way that I see it is through this political lens and through the idea that climate change is something that China also has a strong incentive to fight for domestic political and economic reasons. So I'm not, maybe I'm more optimistic about this, but I'm still somewhat pessimistic of the political will necessary to remove the huge percentage of fossil fuels that are in China's energy mix and economic mix. I am a lot more optimistic about Chinese technological brilliance and human capital in China. And I think one of the things, there's a lot of things that the Trump administration did wrong about China and elsewhere, but I did like the emphasis they had on separating the Chinese Communist Party from the Chinese people. Those are not one and the same. They never have been and they never will be. And so I think when we're having these political discussions and other conversations about China, it's important to note that although the party says that they represent and reflect and basically are China, that is not the fact, and that is not the situation on the ground.
That's a very good point to keep in mind. Do you feel like you will go back to China as soon as you're able when the restrictions are lifted and you miss visiting China?
I do very much miss visiting. I think 2 or 3 years ago, I went to Jiangxi, which was my last Chinese province. So I've at least seen all of them. I think because of the way that Chinese politics are today, I do worry about going and getting seized for breaking some Chinese law, and for jeopardizing state security. I knew both of the Michaels who are now in prison in China, and I think both in support of them, but also for the worry about my own safety. I am much more reluctant to go to China than I would be otherwise. Certainly, if the politics were different, I'd love to go back. And I do feel like the longer I'm away, the more stale a lot of my information gets, especially on the day-to-day. And yeah, there's so many fantastic things about Beijing, but I'm very outspoken about my personal views about the Chinese Communist Party. And so I do worry about my own individual risk. And again, being in the risk business, it's something that I do feel like I have to think a lot about. I think also I want to make sure that I don't change the way that I speak about China, because I'm keeping in the back of my mind, how do I frame these issues so that I will get a visa, so I won't have any problems doing research there. All of the work we do is open source and can be done on a computer. It's quite dangerous to do some of the work that I'm doing on the ground. And it's much more dangerous for Chinese people than for me, and for Chinese Americans, frankly, than for white Americans. Beijing usually targets people of Chinese descent. There feels to be this kind of old school, they should have known better type vibe, or they're all part of the motherland, and so we need to send a message. So I am safer, but it is still, I would say, a risk that's probably too much.
Understood. Yes, even when I went the first time, I was working for Random House, the book publisher, and was there doing business as well as tourism and seeing friends. But when I went back, I was going, to explore the possibilities of connections for the foundation. And I, one night I was with a friend at the New York Times in China in Beijing, and then I went to the China Daily, and someone said to me, "Oh, you'll be followed now because you've done both of those things." I was like, "Oh dear," and it occurred to me, but I'm sure I was fine. But the paranoia begins to rise when you're thinking about the possibilities. Well, what is there something you'd like to say? I'm going to open it up to questions. Do you have a conclusion you'd like to make about your overall feeling about the Biden-U.S. Relations over the next few years before we move on to questions?
I think that the two biggest differences between Biden and Trump in specifically their China policies, one is the way that the Biden team is going to work and is working with Japan, EU, and really leveraging US alliances to what actually now I think we can come out and explicitly say contain China. It was something that Beijing would long say, oh, stop containing China, when that wasn't US policy. And now it's de facto US policy to contain and manage China. I think the other thing is hopefully we'll see both a more predictable and also a more ethical approach and a more values-based approach to US dealing with China. Where that's going to lead, who knows? These things are notoriously difficult to predict, but this is it's a fascinating time to be watching these things.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, let's open it up to questions. If you want to use the reaction, you can raise your hand, or
I'm going to just jump in.
Oh, yes.
There's some advantages to being the executive director. So Isaac, thank you so much. It was really fascinating. What I'd like to know, because I've been hearing that China is thinking that actually they have to open up investment to America and abroad in order to keep their economic influence and gather general valuable information about tech and things like that. And America's looking to invest more. Where do you see opportunity business to business in the next few years between China and the US?
Totally. We've certainly seen some concrete liberalizations in the Chinese financial sector and in the Chinese bond market. And they're part of a result both of Wall Street lobbying and Wall Street's influence on the Biden administration and Beijing's understanding that this is a very important market to have as an advocate for U.S. China relations on the U.S. side. So I think there's a lot there. I mean, certainly for domestically focused Chinese firms, I mean, there's so much excellent growth potential, and from consumer to ag to all sorts of different types of technology. I mean, there's a lot going on there. I think we're well past the point where China is the factory of the world. There's a lot of excellent innovation that's happening there. I think there's also going to be a lot of opportunity in the sort of in this, I'd say, the derivative space of the growth. So how do you move away from state-owned enterprises? How do you invest in Chinese companies or partner with Chinese companies that are less likely to be sanctioned or restricted? I think there's going to be more of an understanding there as various economies around the world try to figure out how to hive out certain parts of China so that they can still tap into Chinese growth, but be less complicit either in human rights violations or supporting the Chinese military.
I see Dana Robbins has asked, do you have any thoughts on what we here in the US can do to help the Uyghurs?
Yes, I think there's a lot that the people can do. I think that there's a lot of really excellent organizations that are involved now. One's called the Uyghur Human Rights Project. They're one of my favorite. They do a lot of really fantastic research work, and depending on how people want to be involved, donating money is excellent, volunteering is excellent, bringing up Xinjiang in conversations about China and about global human rights, I think, is also really important. Some Uyghurs need help getting asylum. There's a lot of sort of basic immigration services that can be provided. Even ESL can be very useful for them. But feel free to email me afterwards, and happy to suggest some names or put you in touch with some folks. But thank you for asking about that.
Super. And Shiraz has his hand up. Shiraz, what's your question?
My question is about US-China competition in Africa. What do you think of it? And do you think the US can compete with China, since China has already got a lot of support from Africans? And my second question is about Iran and China versus US and Iran. How is the ping pong going on? Thank you.
Definitely. So I think there's a wide range of ways the China-African nation relationship and the US-African nation relationship is playing out depending on the country. And I think, Beijing still is more comfortable and has more support among more of the autocratic countries in Africa. I think economically, there's a lot that certain African countries feel very positively about with China's growth model, and it's a very important market for China for UN votes, among other things. In the EV space, the fact that the Democratic Republic of the Congo has roughly 2/3 of the world's supply of cobalt, and cobalt's an integral metal for EV batteries, that's a very important investment for China. The DRC is one of the world's most corrupt and poorest countries, so it's a very difficult place to invest, but there's significant Chinese investment there. And I think the US is mostly staying out of that market because of the ethical and logistical complications of the DRC. In terms of China and Iran, I think that actually a conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia or Iran and Israel could paradoxically be one of the things that brings the US and China closer together. Iran's not all that important to China, and it's not a country that Chinese people or the Chinese party plays all that much attention to, whereas it is a really big hot button issue for Americans for a variety of reasons. So I could certainly expect Beijing to be more willing to work with the US vis-a-vis Iran in exchange for other things.
Interesting. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
Hi, Isaac.
嗨，
你吃过了吗？你吃过了吗？
我吃过，还早呢。
Just to try testing your Chinese.
Oh, yeah.
So thanks again for sharing your knowledge. That was fascinating to me. So you mentioned that you feel a sort of a hesitation going back to China because of personal safety reason. Do you think the same thing applies to Chinese coming to the US?
No, I think it's radically different. And I think there's far more of a risk for Chinese in China than there are for Chinese in the United States. I mean, we do have to remember that Uyghurs are Chinese as well. And so if you add those to the percentages, the odds are much worse for Chinese in China than for Chinese in the United States. At the same time, there has been some horrific anti-Asian violence here. And I do find that deplorable. And I hope that that gets better in the Biden administration and as COVID wanes. But I do feel like there's a really large gap between some of the safety issues that people face in China and safety issues that people face in the United States.
Interesting. Thank you.
Great. Enid, Enid Cumin has her hand up. What's your question, Enid?
Yeah, so hello, Isaac. I was wondering, what is it, do you think, that could bring the greatest feeling of assurance or security to the United States about China, and the same question vice versa, beyond Hong Kong and Taiwan?
That's a great question. I think there's the realistic answer and then there's the honest answer. I think the honest answer is on the US side for the Chinese Communist Party to fall, and on the Chinese side for there to be irreversible US decline and a deep inward focus and a US promise not to defend Taiwan if the PRC invades. I don't expect either of those things to happen. I would say the likelihood of the party falling is higher than the US entering irreversible decline, but who knows? These things are incredibly difficult to predict. I think what's most likely to forestall war or deeper conflict is a conflict elsewhere where the US and China can or decide to work together. And I think the two most likely are Iran and then also North Korea. I do feel like in Beijing's views of its own interests, North Korea is less important to it than the United States and the threat that the United States may pose and the situation in Taiwan. So one could imagine the Chinese yielding quite greatly on North Korea and allowing it to reunify under a democratic government in South Korea in exchange for US commitments elsewhere. I'd say besides that, with the possible exception of climate change, but I think that's less likely, I would say that the US and China are going to continue down this path until something else sparks.
Thank you.
Colette has a question, Isaac. Do you feel the people, I assume the Chinese people, not the government, are happier that Biden is now the president?
I think, and this is a good caveat, there's such a wide range. I mean, so we talk about trying to get a sense of what American people feel. There's roughly 5 times as many people in China and huge variety of viewpoints. Very broadly speaking, I would say that I don't know, it feels pretty mixed. I think some people, there are plenty of people in China who don't like their government and don't like the party and appreciated that Trump spoke out. Some people liked the brash businessman angle. We talked a little bit about the sexism before. I think some Chinese men appreciated and approved of Trump for that. I think for the political folks, it seems to be that there's more fear about Biden than Trump because of Biden's ability to work with other countries to contain China, and because of Biden's expertise and his actual competence in a lot of these things. In terms of what Chinese people, how they react to Biden on a personal level, I really don't know. I'd love to know more about it, but I'm not quite sure. I haven't had any compelling conversations with Chinese people where anything's stuck.
And do you feel, I was struck when I was there, it seems there's the average person doesn't have much access to outside news. It's a state-run TV and state-run newspaper. So I remember the few people, I didn't talk politics when I was there, but a couple of people said, Trump's so decisive.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard that line before. I mean, I think a lot of people get information from WeChat and from Weibo, and I think in many ways it's an issue of being, having access to Chinese language information, and Chinese language information being far more influenced and controlled by Beijing than English language information. So a lot of times you can either via VPN or another way, get access to the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, but it's just a lot of the content that you'd want to read is only in English. And so even for Chinese people who speak excellent or fluent English, most of the time you're just more comfortable reading news in your native language.
Yes. Do we have any other questions?
I have a question, Isaac, with your insights. What do you think is the best way to start fighting the anti-Asian sentiment in America? I mean, clearly there are historical roots, and a lot of this is just the, unfolding, a la, Black Lives Matter, of inherent racism that has to be addressed. But given your insights about China, do you think there are ways for us to address this so that we can lower the temperature, or do you think this is just the kind of uncovering of something that is systemic racism?
I think that's a great question. Do you mean for your organization or for individuals or for whom?
However you want to opine. I mean, certainly it's a question we as a foundation are dealing with. We want to be a force for improving the situation. We want to jump in. We want to make a difference. What are your insights and ways that, we all can kind of be a force for improving the situation, but given insights being, Chinese scholars or either from China, what can we do to make a difference now?
I think so. There's recognizing the language that we use when we frame some of these issues. I mean, I think that the China flu was the easiest one, but making sure that we're not inadvertently describing these issues in ways that are just automatically offensive. I wrote a piece 6 months ago or so about how there's still, I think, about 50 place names in the United States with the word Chinaman in them. And, some people would say, well, it's just like saying Englishman. Well, it's not just like saying Englishman. I'm Jewish. You can say Jewish, but if you call someone a Jew, well, that's offensive, not because there's anything inherently offensive in the word, but in the way that the word is used. So Eric Liu, who's a former Obama speechwriter, wrote a book. I think it might have used that phrase. I think it might have been called A Chinaman's Chance, as sort of a take on that old expression. And he talked about how when people would describe, say, Chinese hackers, they would use terms like burrowing Chinese hackers burrowing into the system. And that is an animalistic, sort of an insect-like term. So not using language like that, or using similar language that you use to describe Russian hackers or German hackers. I think also being very explicit about separating the Chinese Communist Party from Chinese people. I think one of the things that I haven't been excited about Biden about is it's a lot about China, Beijing, China, but separating the party and the people and understanding the real difference there, because frankly, tensions between the US and China could get far worse. And the more that people subscribe to this idea that the Communist Party and Chinese people are the same, the more that frustrations at the Communist Party will be very, very inappropriately taken out on Chinese Americans or Chinese people. So being very, very distinct about those two entities, I think, is incredibly important. But I'd also love to hear other suggestions from you or for other people. There's also, just as a final thing, Jack Chen at the Museum of Chinese in America, and I think at Rutgers, wrote an excellent book called Yellow Peril, which is a history of anti-Chinese sentiment, and talks a lot about the, this is sort of visceral disgust that early propaganda had against Chinese. And Frank Wu, who I think is now the president of Queens College, wrote a book called Yellow, Race in America After Black and White. And he also has a lot of really compelling and thoughtful things to say about it.
That's very helpful. I see, Marissa, it looks like you might have a follow-up, and then we'll go to Enid's question. Ms. Mercer, you're on mute. Did you have something you wanted to say?
That was just me saying thank you for your comments.
Okay, very good. Enid, your question?
Yeah, okay. So Isaac, before you talked a bit about businessmen brought down by corruption, but it seems that this less often happens to top politicians. Not that it never happens, but is it that politicians are less likely to be corrupt, or that politicians are more likely or more able to use corruption against businessmen? Thanks.
It's a good question. I would say it's certainly the latter. There's a Chinese concept, original sin, the same word that they use for the Christian concept, but it also means the crimes that a businessman or a politician had to commit in order to get their fortune. So it's believed that all top business people and all top politicians in China are corrupt to a degree, or at the very least have corrupt family members. And that has led to probably deserved cynicism that people who get taken down just get taken down because they've lost what the Chinese call their protective umbrella, that the person above them no longer supports them or doesn't support them in the same way. So I think the reason that we're seeing businessmen targeted now, one is they have targeted a lot of politicians over the 8 years that Xi has been in office. But the second reason is that politicians are seen as less of a threat to the Communist Party because they're within the party. And the politicians who are seen as a threat to the party, and this is just speculation because I don't know what's going on at the top of the party, but politicians at the top of the party are too powerful to be taken down in the way that we see Jack Ma being taken down right now.
Very good. Yeah, so I think we can wrap it up here if there's no more questions. A couple comments on chat that Isaac, you can look at. And I want to thank everyone for coming. And I want to thank Isaac for a wonderful talk. As always, wonderful to hear your thoughts. And you can follow him on his, there's information about him on our website, and you can follow him and as many writing and speaking engagements. And also we look forward to your book coming out. Do you have a title yet, or is that too early for that?
The working title is America Second, which I don't know if in Chinese they'll translate as 美国很二. I sort of hope they don't. But right now, that's what we're going to call it. And if anyone has a suggestion for a better title, always happy to hear it.
I'm sure you'll put also something in the subtitle or the line below that.
Yes, yes.
Well, great. Thank you so much. And we're back next Thursday with a wonderful Dutch singer, Judith Mock, who has fought COVID by doing concerts in Dublin, free concerts that brought the city together, and won her an award, but she has a fascinating career and singing life. So next Thursday at 4, we'll hear from Judith. Okay, thank you, Isaac. Thank you, Leslie.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much.
everyone.
Take care.
Bye.
Wonderful. Bye-bye.